welcome to the Minnesota Gardening Podcast. My friends, it is an honor to have you here with us today. My name is Brad Tabke, and we have the Minnesota Gardening Podcast to help new gardeners and old gardeners as well learn more about gardening and landscape. And today we have another great guest for you. We have Brian Schwingle, who is the Central Region Forest Health Specialist for the Minnesota DNR, and he is going to work with us today and talk about Oak Wilt. So first, I just want to make sure our listeners know that this episode, if you go to minnesotagardening.com and click on podcast, you'll be able to see all the show notes for this episode. So we'll be putting different information in there for folks to be able to find. And what Oak Wilt is oddly like near and dear to my heart because bur oaks are my favorite plant and one of my favorite things. And there is a whole stand of older growth bur oaks in Shakopee that are just falling like flies to Oak Wilt. And it's just the saddest thing to watch happen as it, quickly creeps through the entire grove of oaks. And so I wanted to talk to Brian today about what is going on with Oak Wilt and why people need to be curious and pay attention to it, as well as what's hopeful for the future. So Brian, why don't you first start with just introducing what you do for the DNR and how you're helping keeping our forests safe?
People can think of me as kind of like the CDC for Minnesota's forests. So I'm a part of a team of 5 people. And, we're all there are 4 forest health specialists for the state, and then we have a coordinator. And we kind of operate like kind of a combination of the CDC, Center for Disease Control, and then like your general practitioner. So we're charged with monitoring forest health conditions across the state every year. And so maybe that might comprise like 25% of our jobs. We coordinate a big aerial survey to detect large sweeping changes and to track trends over Minnesota's forests annually. But our bread and butter really is troubleshooting for forest managers. When they can't figure stuff out in the woods, they'll call us and we come in and we investigate what's going on.
Can you tell our listeners what Oak Wilt is and kind of give a little history as to Oak Wilt in Minnesota?
You bet. I can talk.
I love it
about Oak Wilt, Brad. Yeah. So Oak Wilt is a fatal disease of oak species. It is thought to not be native to the United States. Scientists don't know where it originated from. But there are several lines of evidence to suggest that it's not native. Number one being that there's no known resistance out there amongst our red oak species. And so it was first discovered in the United States, actually in Wisconsin, which is it's very unusual to discover a non-native tree pest in the middle of the country. Usually they're discovered on ports, like emerald ash borer was discovered in Detroit, which is a port. So that was unusual, but it was discovered in the 40s, and in Minnesota it was also discovered in the 40s in, I believe, 4 counties bordering Wisconsin. So right around the Twin Cities and down to Red Wing. And since that time, Oak Wilt has slowly crept out from the Twin Cities metro area to the southeast and to the north. And so currently it extends almost to Moose Lake and over to Little Falls. And actually, unfortunately, we discovered Oak Wilt for the first time in Brainerd country in 2021, which is extremely concerning. And then it extends all the way down to the Iowa border. I imagine several of you listeners out there are familiar with Dutch elm disease. You can think of Oak Wilt as the Dutch elm disease of oaks. Fortunately, it's not as inefficient of a mover as Dutch elm disease. So Dutch elm disease, it's a fungal vascular wilt. So, when I say vascular wilt, that refers to basically the plumbing in the tree just under the bark, the tubes that carry up the water and distribute the sugars that trees make through photosynthesis all throughout the tree. So these vascular wilts, they basically kill those vascular tubes, the xylem and the phloem, if you've heard of that, the tubes, and they block them up. And both of these diseases, Dutch elm disease and oak wilt, they're carried from an infected tree longer distances to an uninfected tree by insects. And the insects that carry Dutch elm disease from an infected tree or an infected like wood pile to an uninfected tree, they're bark beetles, and they don't need a wound to introduce the disease into a tree. They can bore right in. And that's the major difference between Dutch elm disease and oak wilt, because with oak wilt, like over 90% of the insects that transport oak wilt between oaks, they require a fresh wound. So like think a pruning cut, or think of a truck that accidentally, rubbed up against a portion of a big old bur oak trunk and rubbed that bark off. Those fresh wounds that expose the sapwood, those are the wounds that, they send out these chemical volatiles, and they attract these insects that inadvertently drop off oak wilt spores, and that's how disease begins over 90% of the time. Of course, these insects, they transport oak wilt, from an infected tree or an infected wood pile to an uninfected zone. And they can fly, I think the data says 95% of them will fly up to about a quarter mile from an infected zone. And then they get these what we call infection centers going. Now, unfortunately, the really bad news is that once a single oak is infected, then that disease moves from that oak to neighboring oaks, to their neighbors, and they create these circles of death in our landscape. And they're able to do that because trees that are the same species, so for example, two bur oaks, they frequently graft their roots. So their roots grow together and almost become one, which makes like an underground highway, unimpeded highway for these vascular wilts like oak wilt to move from one oak to the other. And so, like 90% of death that occurs from oak wilt actually happens through that underground movement. That's not to say, though, that the insect movement above ground, that's extremely important.
So does oak wilt move around, like you said there's a new infestation in Brainerd, and does that move along with like firewood at that point, or newly cut logs, or how does that move a long distance to jump like that?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, oak wilt definitely can, it easily moves on firewood. So I know, I used to work for Wisconsin DNR, and Wisconsin DNR did a campground user survey when I worked for them. Firewood, people are very particular about campfire wood. So yes, and we all know that oak puts out a lot of BTUs when you burn it. And so it's a really nice firewood. And so, yeah, if an oak tree, let's say an oak tree in Rochester, let's say a northern red oak tree dies of oak wilt in August of 2022, there's a very high likelihood that oak tree that was killed in August of 2022 is going to produce the oak wilt spores in May or June of 2020.
Wow.
And it's going to, and see those spores, they attract those insect vectors. They actually smell, humans can smell them. I think they smell like bananas. And they form just under the bark, and actually they form these structures called pressure pads, one on the outside of the sapwood and then in a mirror of that on the inside of the bark, and they press against each other and they pop the bark open, and around them forms this, it's like maybe 100 square inch kind of oval zone of spores. And they smell like bananas. Some people think they smell like red wine, juicy fruit gum.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that one? But anyways, they attract those insects and the insects, I don't know if they feed on them or what, but they inadvertently pick up the spores, and then those insects are also attracted to fresh wounds. And so if that homeowner in Rochester were to cut that oak down, whenever, September, October, November, December, it really wouldn't matter. And they were like, you know what? We need to replenish our cabin's firewood supply, and they were to drive that up to Brainerd. Boom. You get Oak Wilt spore production at that cabin in May or June of 2023. And any oak that's wounded from anything, whether it be a lawnmower, a truck, somebody nailing something into the trees, someone pruning in May or June, any oak within a quarter mile stands a decent chance of being infected from that firewood pile.
Homeowner, how would they know if they have oak wilt on that red oak that's growing there? How would they know that they have oak wilt on that tree, or what are good indications and symptoms of oak wilt?
So to diagnose oak wilt on a red oak is, I guess you could say it's pretty easy, because the distinguishing characteristic is that the tree its crown, its leaves will rapidly change color, and it will lose about 90% or more of its leaves within like 1 to 2 months of that rapid color change.
Is there a specific time of year to watch for that?
Well, it can happen May through September. So, in May, it's very difficult to diagnose oak wilt in the field. I always recommend people submit a lab sample, or submit a sample to a lab like the University of Minnesota's Plant Disease Clinic or the University of Wisconsin's Plant Disease Clinic. Same goes for September, because at those kind of shoulder times of the growing season, you can get other problems with trees, or just kind of natural changes in tree canopy. You can get those things kind of obscure classic oak wilt symptoms. But from June through August, again, if you're looking at a red oak and it was healthy in May, 100% healthy, and in those months it literally dropped over 90% of its leaves, and many of those leaves were totally green or partially green, there's nothing that does that to a northern red.
And then
diagnosing oak.
No, I just say, and then when you see that happen, is that just a single seasons? Like it was, let's say in our scenario from before, that it was a tree was cut down and oaks surrounding that were infected in the spring of 22, and then that it will fully defoliate the tree the summer of 22, or does it take a few years to get up to that level, or what's the time frame?
The time frame on a northern red oak is like 2 months, which is, again, that
crazy,
is a distinguishing feature, because there are many things, there are many diseases and pests that can kill oaks over a number of years, and some of them can kill oaks in a single growing season. The major characteristic of oak wilt on red oaks is that they'll be totally healthy at the beginning of the growing season, and then in a 2-month time frame they will die completely. They'll lose like 90% of their leaves or more within a month or 2 months. It's a very drastic.
So, and that tree is done then, and it's just never leafing out. It's just 2 months dead tree.
Correct. It's done. Yep. There are some confusing things that I've seen over my career, where some red oaks they'll produce sucker sprouts along their stems. Other names for sucker sprouts are epicormics or water sprouts, little shoots that rapidly grow out of the trunk. I've seen oaks killed by oak wilt, produce a bunch of epicormics up and down their stem, but those epicormic branches or water sprouts, they'll continuously die over and over again. So it's kind of like these trees are, they're given their last effort at living. They're putting everything they can into survival, but they can't beat off that disease and they die. But for most of the listeners out there, it's like red oak, it would be totally healthy in May or June, and then in July or August, it would lose 90% of its leaves over the course of 1 to 2 months. Their lawns would be covered with leaves, and that's...
And then do those leaves also carry oak wilt with them? Is that a source of spores, or is it just the wood?
Fortunately, the leaves do not harbor the disease. It's only the wood. And like I was on an Oak Wilt conference earlier this week, and the question came up, well, what about the acorns? Do the acorns transport the disease? And it's not to our knowledge. It's just that the wood that is fatal. And not on interesting. So the way I've been describing this disease, that's just been on red oaks. So we have 3 species of red oaks in Minnesota: black oak, northern red oak, and northern pin oak. All of these oaks, we generally refer to them as red oaks, and the major characteristic that they have is that they have sharply pointed ends to their leaves. So we call those like lobes to leaves, the parts that stick out like peninsulas everywhere. They're sharp. They come to a very sharp point on our red oak species. Whereas with our white oak group, so those are bur oaks, white oaks, and swamp white oaks, those have rounded lobes. And so, I talked about red, like the symptoms and the disease on red oak, and how if you're paying attention, which is actually easier said than done, it's a very drastic, hit you in your face type of disease. That's not the case with white oaks. With white oak, the disease is much, much more complicated to diagnose. So, like, for example, with bur oak, I've seen bur oaks get oak wilt, and I've seen them die in a single growing season, almost as severely and as quickly as it happens on red oaks. I've also seen big old kind of decline over the course of a few years from oak wilt. So we generally say that like red oaks are highly susceptible to oak wilt, bur oaks are kind of moderately susceptible, and our white oak species, Quercus alba, that's not as susceptible to oak wilt. Now, I don't like that terminology because it makes people think, oh, well, I have a white oak, that means it's not very much at risk of oak wilt. And that's not true. Once oak wilt infects any of our red oak species or any of our bur oak species, those trees are going to die. I have seen white oaks get oak wilt and not die and actually recover from the disease. And that's been observed by other people over the years too in Minnesota. It's kind of widely known that our white oak in the eastern part of this country is somewhat not as susceptible. But with bur oak, like I know at the beginning of this show you talked about your love for bur oak. I love it too. It's my favorite tree. I've seen oak wilt kind of create these disease centers in pure forests of bur oak.
Got it. And so how is this different? We had back in, I think it was episode 7, we had an episode with a master gardener who taught us all about bur oak blight. And how is oak wilt different from bur oak blight and other funguses that we might see on oak trees?
Bur oak blight is a leaf disease. It only infects the leaves. And it's not very severe. It's gotten a lot of press in the upper Midwest over the last several years, but it's nothing like oak wilt. I've never seen bur oak blight. In my opinion, I've never seen bur oak blight kill a tree. We have my predecessor. He photographed the same bur oak in southern Minnesota, and it got bur oak blight. I think he photographed it for like 17 years in a row, and every year it lost like 90% of its canopy in September but it leafed out just fine.
Wow,
the
that's
following
fun.
year. Whereas now, if that bur oak would have gotten oak wilt, it would have died within 7
Got
years.
it. So we've talked about what
Yeah.
oak wilt is and what are the number one, I guess, what is the number one action step that homeowners can take to prevent their trees from getting oak wilt?
Basically, do not touch your oak from April through July. If you're able to, minimize any wounding of that tree, that's going to go a long, long ways at preventing oak wilt. Of course, there's Mother Nature and there's windstorms, and so windstorms can easily break a branch in May or June, and that wound could be infected by oak wilt. But the major thing, that number one thing that I would ask everyone to do is just don't prune your oaks from April through July. It seems like such a simple request, but I understand this too, because I feel this way when the weather, when you finally get like your first amazing kind of almost summer-like day in April or May where you could go outside without a heavy coat and just feel really comfortable. Like everyone in my neighborhood anyways, and wherever I've been, that's when you feel like cleaning up your yard and doing stuff outside, and I think, that's when people oftentimes they want to get out there and they want to prune their own. They don't want to prune in December or January or February when, if there's like 3 feet of snow on the ground, but that is the time.
So do you guys also recommend,
particularly, February?
Sorry, go ahead, Brian. I was just going to say, so do you also recommend during that time frame not to do like planting of new trees or other things like that, because you inevitably break some branches and do some things like that when you have a new tree going in the ground? Or is it mostly just don't touch them pruning? And that also brings up another question you can answer at the same time of, is there any difference between the ages of the trees as to being more susceptible or less susceptible to oak wilt?
Yeah, well, to hit on your first question, it's really all about just avoid wounding. A great time to plant trees, of course, is as soon as the frost is out of the soil. Like that is a prime time to plant trees. And that's an interesting question you have. I've never thought about that actually. Like if people are planting like a big old, like, ball and burlap, 10-foot tall oak, I've never really thought about how it could possibly get oak wilt just from being transported and wounding branches and stuff like that. I suppose it could happen, but still, like it would be much better to plant a tree in April as soon as the frost leaves the ground than say like in June or July where it's just the stress from just the moisture loss is going to be so much higher because of the temperatures.
Perfect. So with that as well as,
and Brad, I'm very
sorry, that was a classic podcast interviewer massive fail right there. So I'm sorry about that. The second one was about, is there any difference between the age of the tree as to if it's more or less susceptible to oak wilt?
Oh, that's a good question. We aren't aware that there's any sort of difference in disease susceptibility from young to older oaks. But I would say, and this is just my kind of best guess, almost kind of like I'm like a layman meteorologist here, but I'm guessing that the older and larger an oak is, the more likely it is to be wounded naturally by whatever, by squirrels feeding on it just because there's more surface area or wind damage. And so I would guess that, as an oak grows bigger and bigger, the likelihood that's going to be wounded in the spring increases, and therefore the risk of natural overland infection of oak wilt increases. I rarely see young oaks, say, shorter than 10 feet, get infected from oak wilt. Unless they're pruned, then they'll definitely get oak wilt if they're in oak wilt country, or if they're growing very close to a tree that got oak wilt. I've seen smaller trees get infected too. I mean, I've seen, I don't know if your listeners know this, but like when you cut a red oak in Minnesota, what happens frequently is that you get these water sprouts, or I call them stump sprouts, growing from that cut stump. Frequently you'll see 20 sucker sprouts, and that's just because you cut down a tree doesn't mean you're killing the tree. Technically, that root system is alive, and there are all these dormant buds on the root collar, so where the stump meets the roots, and those can kind of wake up and they'll start growing a new top. And I've seen those little shoots that are less than an inch in diameter get oak wilt from underground movement. Frequently, I see that.
And with that as well, Brian, we're running up against the end of our time here today. So we've talked a lot about what oak wilt is and how it gets transported, and making sure that people don't prune oak trees of any sort between April and July each year to reduce their susceptibility to oak wilt. Where is the hope in where oak wilt is going? Is there great research that's being done on it? Are we finding trees, especially in the red oak side, that are resistant to it? Where are things going?
I call oak wilt, it's the invasive that everyone has forgotten. I feel like oak wilt, of all the invasive species that kill trees in Minnesota, it is the invasive species that I wish we could pour money into in terms of controlling its spread. It's very unique in that it actually, as an invasive species, it moves so slowly. So, it's been in Wisconsin and Minnesota since the 40s. Likely it's been there for a few decades before that, but it still hasn't encroached upon our northern forests. And in fact, in Minnesota, it's, we do not know of any oak wilt occurrences north of Pine County or north of now the Brainerd zone. And so there's still if you take a look at the range of oak in Minnesota, oak wilt still has not covered 50% of its range, yet it's been here for sure since the 40s. When you contrast that to Dutch elm disease, I don't know exactly when Dutch elm disease was first discovered in Minnesota. I think the 60s or the 70s. But it had covered the entire range of elm in Minnesota within a few decades. And, you take, there's another story out east. It's called chestnut blight. That was a horrendously devastating disease of American chestnut. It covered the entire range of American chestnut within a few decades. The same goes for butternut canker. Butternut it's also known as white walnut. It's a native tree to Minnesota, wonderful tree. It's on our state endangered species list because of a non-native disease that quickly covered its entire range. And so oak wilt's really unique in that it's slow spreader, and we know how to control it in multiple different ways, which again can't be said for many tree diseases, or even I shouldn't say tree disease, but I'll put it this way. Forest diseases or forest pests. When we're trying to control things on a grand scale, frequently it's there's not a lot of, usually the goal is to drastically slow its spread. Take emerald ash borer, for example. The goal is to drastically slow its spread using quarantines. But with oak wilt, even if you live in, let's say, Wabasha, if you get oak wilt's been there for decades, but if you get oak wilt in your woodlot or in your yard, there are ways to control it, which is really cool. So that's promising. The other promising thing, and this is, now I work for the Minnesota DNR, for the state government. So my perspective is kind of larger scale. I'm looking at, I want to protect the state's forests. And so almost a decade ago now, we started thinking about oak wilt kind of like a fire, and how this fire has slowly been spreading out from the Twin Cities and Red Wings since the 40s. And the deal is like, how do you control a fire? You spray its edges. You don't like pour a bucket of water into a giant wildfire. Like, you don't pour it in the middle of it. You attack the edges. So right now we have actually the Morrison County Soil and Water Conservation District. They got a big Oak Wilt control grant from the state legislature to provide funding to area residents for full Oak Wilt control if they get Oak Wilt. And so the whole goal there is to basically stop Oak Wilt spread in central Minnesota and prevent it from encroaching into our northern. And we also have some cost share available, funding available for affected woodland owners in Pine County too, to try and stop its spread. In our St. Croix State Park, we battle Oak Wilt every year with a grant that we get from the federal government. So that's the strategy. It's to slow its spread, to stop its spread northward. And the forest health problems that I've ever been aware of, we actually stand a chance. But I think the key is for everybody to keep their eye on the ball. So, Brad, I super appreciate you having interest in Oak Wilt. I think this is, the more people we can let know about Oak Wilt, the better. Every year I spend considerable amount of time detecting Oak Wilt with satellites. We partner with all kinds of researchers who are trying to detect forest health problems with satellites. We do these aerial surveys in airplanes. So every year I'm up in an airplane looking really hard down at the forest to try and detect Oak Wilt at as early a stage as possible. And sometimes we have success with those tools, but almost like 90% or more of the early detections of Oak Wilt that we get are from homeowners who think, oh, maybe the DNR wants to know about this. Maybe they'll help me. And so the more people that know that we're looking for Oak Wilt, north of like Little Falls in Morrison County and north of Hinckley.
And Brian, you talked earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt you there. You talked earlier about the battle of like St. Croix State Park and keeping the edges of the fire contained. What does that look like? Is that just simply, is it tree removal like we do with emerald ash borer? Is it some sort of antifungal? What does that battle look like?
That battle can look like all different kinds of things. The Minnesota DNR, a few years ago, put out an Oak Wilt management guide. And so if people really want to know, they should like...
Yeah, and I'll put it in the show notes as well for this episode.
Yeah, that's great. Anyways, we have this Minnesota DNR Oak Wilt guide, and that goes over in great detail on all the different ways on how to control Oak Wilt. So it really was written for forest managers. But for example, so like in St. Croix State Park, we use a tool called a vibratory plow. That it has a 5-foot long vertically oriented like big knife on the back of like a cat, like a bobcat, and it vibrates up and down, and it goes around an Oak Wilt disease center and separates the roots from the trees that are infected and the healthy oaks out to the outside. And we always want to put a buffer of healthy looking trees around the dead and dying trees, because those healthy looking trees, there's a very good chance that some of them have Oak Wilt already in their root system. Trees don't show symptoms of the disease until the disease creeps up into their trunk. And so that makes it difficult to know exactly how to control. But that's what that looks like. So we basically separate.
Got it.
And they're, in forests, sometimes we can use excavators to pop out stumps or bulldozers to push out stumps. Now, those are really kind of destructive ways. But the thing is, if you let Oak Wilt go, it becomes even more destructive. And what happens oftentimes is Oak Wilt slowly creates this hole in the forest, and what grows in that hole? Buckthorn, frequently buckthorn and red maple and box elder, and most people don't want that. Most people want a beautiful oak forest. But in people's yards, say around the Twin Cities area or Rochester or anywhere really, you can prevent oak wilt by injecting a healthy tree with a fungicide. And so that's probably a whole podcast right there. And I don't know a tremendous amount about that, but certainly there are hundreds of arborists in Minnesota who can help homeowners with that. And so that's a preventative fungicide.
That's good to know. So awesome. We are way over time, which I love because it's a really important topic to talk about, and you're great to talk with about it. But Brian, is there anything about oak wilt that I haven't asked you about that you want to make sure that people know?
Oh, Brad, I'm sorry I talked so long. I think we nailed all of it. I mean, there's, you in a 30-minute podcast or whatever, you can only cover so much. There's a lot to know about oak wilt, and there are a couple great websites that I would prefer. Like for people who want to know about oak wilt, I would greatly prefer that they go to Minnesota DNR's oak wilt web pages or the University of Minnesota's oak wilt web pages. They have a lot there for people to
and they're really, really great resources for folks. And like I said, I'll link to those in the show notes for this episode. So if people just go to minnesotagardening.com and then search for episode 17 or Oak Wilt, it'll all come up on there. So Brian Schwingle from Minnesota DNR, thank you so much for all of your incredible knowledge and talking with folks about oak wilt and teaching what you know. And the main thing that we want to make sure that folks remember is do not prune your oaks from between April and July each year. That will help significantly in the reduction in the spread of oak wilt. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for being here, Brian. I appreciate you. See what I mean? Brian was just awesome in talking and sharing about oak wilt and just has so much knowledge as to what's going on and what we can do as homeowners and land managers to help control oak wilt and what to look for and see with that. So with that, you can make sure to remember to go to the show notes at minnesotagardening.com. You can click and download anything that's there. If you search for Oak Wilt or episode 17, you will find all the information there. And then next week for episode 18, we have an incredibly awesome woman leader. She's just incredible and a great friend of mine, Heidi Highland from Heidi's Grow House and Heidi's Lakeshore Gardens is here to talk about trends and focus in the 2022 landscape season. So we'll see you again next week. And if you could please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Would love to have you subscribing and sharing this with friends. We hope that everybody is learning a lot here. We're 17 episodes in. You got a good feel as to what the podcast is, and would love for you to subscribe. Make sure that you're getting this each week when it comes out, as well as share it with your friends and give us a rating so that other folks know what the podcast is and know what you know. So we've got some pretty big changes coming up here in the next few weeks for the Minnesota Gardening Podcast that I think that you really, really like. So just hold on and make sure to be subscribed so you find out as soon as everyone else. Have a great day.